It's been a while. This is the longest break I've taken since I started this channel, and unfortunately it wasn't by choice. Back in July, my studio was flooded, so I've been rebuilding for the last few months. So sorry I haven't been responding to many emails or posting any new content. I'll get back on it soon, reply to those emails, and hope to be posting regularly in the new year again. Anyway, last week I was messing around again with pulse width modulation. I've done a bunch of videos about using pulse waves as clocks with the Matriarch and DFAM, but haven't really talked too much about using it for sound design. So I thought it was about time to post another video and take a closer look at pulse waves and pulse width modulation. The Mother 32 is perfect for demonstrating the basic idea I want to talk about in this video: pulse width modulation at audio rate. Or I guess you could call it pulse width frequency modulation, because that's sort of what's going on here. So I'm going to stick primarily with the Mother in this video to get us started with this concept, but I'll talk a little bit about this Roland 512. And for all you Matriarch users, there will be more Matriarch content coming soon. In the next video, I'll go way deeper with pulse width modulation with the Matriarch. And I've started working on one of the most requested videos, a deep dive of the Matriarch's delay. And in the next few months, I'll be doing some more recreations of Kraftwerk and Daft Punk patches with the Matriarch. Okay, as always, there's an index in the description and links to patch diagrams on my website, so let's get going. But first, here's a little sample of some of the patches we'll work on in this video. Okay, pulse width modulation. We all probably know what that means, but let's start at the beginning anyway and take a look at pulse waves themselves. So I'm going to patch in a scope and a spectrometer. The first thing I guess I should show you is that even with the filter and VCA fully open, they're still affecting the wave. As you can see on the scope, we aren't getting a perfect square. In fact, I don't think I've ever played an analog synth that produces a perfect square. If it's patched through the filter in VCA. I think that's more of a digital thing. Anyway, if we bypass the filter in VCA and take the direct wave out, we'll get our perfect square, or at least really close. You can also hear that the direct out is a little brighter than the VCA out. If we freeze the spectrometer, we can get a rough idea of the frequencies of the harmonics present in our pulse wave. Okay, I'm not going to get into the math and physics of pulse waves, it's really complicated, but in the simplest terms, a perfect square wave has a 50% duty cycle and does not have any even harmonics. So let's compare a pulse wave to a saw wave. Saw wave, we've got even and odd harmonics, so all harmonics are present. You know what? Maybe we should do some quick physics. Might be easier to understand. All right, let's look at the harmonic content of a saw wave first, because it's a little easier to understand. A tone is comprised of a fundamental, which in musical terms you'd probably call the root, but the fundamental is the frequency that we'd associate with the pitch of a given note. The harmonics are all integer multiplications of the fundamental. So for instance, if we play an A440, the first harmonic would be at 880 Hertz, and the third would be at 1320 Hertz or 1.3 kilohertz, etc., etc. In a saw wave, the amplitude of each harmonic is divided by the number of the harmonic. So the fundamental is 1 to 1. The amplitude of the second harmonic is 1 divided by 2, so 50%. The third harmonic is 1 divided by 3, so 33.333. The fourth is 1 divided by 4, so a quarter or 25%, etc., etc. But for a pulse wave, it's a little bit more complex. Actually, it's a little bit more than a little bit more complex. Okay, so the duty cycle of a pulse wave refers to the period of time, usually expressed as a percentage, in which the amplitude of the pulse remains high in relation to the total period of the wave. So a pure square wave, for instance, would have a duty cycle of 50%. A narrow pulse, like on the Moog Matriarch or Mini Moog, may be 10 or 20%, for instance. Determining the harmonic content of a pulse wave is pretty tricky. We get into math that looks like this. So I'm not going to get into that, but here's an easy oversimplification. So we're going to express the period of the wave as 100%. The period of the wave, again, is the amount of time it takes for a wave to fully cycle. We're going to divide that by the percentage of the duty cycle, and the result will be which harmonics we have to skip or will be missing in our pulse wave. So for instance, if we have a perfect square, 100 divided by 50 is 2, so every second harmonic is missing. So that simple little equation works great for a square or for any wave with a duty cycle that will evenly divide 100, but that does not work at all for, say, a wave with a 75% duty cycle. 100 divided by 75 is 1.33333. That obviously won't work. We can't skip every 1.3 harmonics. Harmonics are integer multiplications of the fundamental. So that's not going to work. So that's where math will end for this video, and we'll just have to use our ears and use the spectrum analyzer to see and hear what's happening. Okay, so here's our square wave with the duty cycle of 50%. So every second harmonic is missing. So I'm going to slightly change the pulse width and we'll see those harmonics jump back in. There they are. So now we're into the difficult to explain with math type waves. So we'll just listen to the character of the sound as I slowly change the pulse width. On the oscilloscope, you can see the duty cycle of the wave is increasing, and on the spectrometer, even though it's a bit slow, you can see that the harmonics, there isn't a recognizable pattern, but the sound is definitely changing, more nasal. As the duty cycle gets longer, the sound gets thinner, and it kind of sounds and looks like it's being filtered by a notch filter or a comb filter or something. Anyway, so you can hear that we get a variety of tones. Narrow pulse was used a lot in the old days to replicate string instruments. And if I sweep the pulse width knob, we're essentially getting manual pulse width modulation. So let's look at the most common ways to modulate a pulse wave. Maybe this will give you some ideas for your own patches. Probably the most common modulation source for pulse width modulation is an envelope generator. So I'm just going to quickly repatch so we can see all this on the scope. I'm going to patch out of the VCA instead of direct out of the VCO. And I'm going to patch the envelope generator out into the mult. I'm going to go out of the first channel of the mult into the external audio input on the Mother 32. This is mainly for later on when we look at LFOs. And out of the second channel into my scope. And I'm going to make sure the VCO mod source is set to my envelope generator. So no patching required yet. That was all done internally. It's just so we can see everything on the scopes. The scope on the left is the VCA out, so we'll see our wave shape there. The scope in the center is the CV from the envelope generator, and the frequency spectrograph is on the right. You can hear the pulse width changing throughout the duration of the note. This will actually be easier to hear if we bypass the VCA. Yeah, no, it's obvious what's going on. Cool. Let's hear that with the sequence. You can hear that the pulse width modulation is really adding a lot of expression or movement to the sequence. Let's just turn up the decay a bit. Now, if I take the pulse width modulation out, you'll hear how lifeless this sequence sounds. Real bland. Okay, so that's one of the most common uses for pulse width modulation, to add some movement and shape to a patch. At the moment I've got the VCO modulation amount at about 50%, but let's see what happens if we keep increasing it. And we're hearing that nasally sound come in at the beginning of the note. And as we keep going up, now the wave is starting to cut out a bit. Cool. So with a high amount of pulse width modulation, the envelope is modulating the pulse width duty cycle to pretty much 0. That's why the notes are cutting out and we get that cool heavy click or transient at the beginning of each note. Not all synths will let you modulate the pulse width this much, but the Mother does, so it's pretty cool. It could be useful for some aggressive bass or percussive tones. The Mother has a 3-stage envelope. If we flip this switch, it becomes an ASR envelope. So let's see what happens if we add sustain and keep the pulse width modulation high. With attack at 0, we get a little click at the beginning of the note as the pulse width quickly is modulated to a wave with a duty cycle of 0%. And as I hold the note, the sustain keeps the duty cycle at 0. When I release the key, the duty cycle is modulated back, so sustain acts almost like a note delay in this case. And if I decrease the modulation amount a little bit, I can get that transient at the beginning to be a little bit more noticeable. Cool, that one worked well. Kind of reminds me of somebody trying to spit. If we increase the attack, we can make it even more predominant. Cool. So you can hear that this is a pretty interesting way to modify a sequence. That's pretty cool. And with no pulse width modulation? Boring. Cool. Sounds like the notes are being torn. Okay, let's see what happens if we get our envelope kind of like a triangle shape with the attack and decay both at around 50%. Let's get rid of sustain. Cool. So we can use this to double notes. Check this out. Perfect for a slow sequence like this. There we go. Double notes. Cool. Mess around a little bit. Try speeding it up. Gotta adjust the envelope. Actually, work better slower. Let's slow it back down. Small movements work best. Just decrease the pulse width modulation a tiny bit. There we go. I'm getting into perfection mode. I want this to be a nice clear double, so I'm just going to mess around a bit more. I think I got to speed up my envelope a little bit, and I'll keep them both at around the same time. Okay, that's close enough. Let's just dial in some filter modulation. Filter is being modulated by the envelope, and you're going to hear that the doubled note is now going to be brighter than the first note. Cool. So it's like having two different attacks. All just from pulse width modulation. Super cool. Let's slow down the decay, or increase the decay, sorry, and really exaggerate that brighter note. Modulating the decay would be a really cool thing to do in this patch. I really wish Moog would put CV controllable envelopes in their synths. Oh well. Okay, the next most common way to modulate the pulse width would be with an LFO, so let's just patch our triangle LFO into our mult. This again is just so that we can see it on the scope. we're going to take care of the modulation with this little switch. Okay, let's turn on the VCA and hear what this sounds like. The LFO is pretty slow. And you can hear it just slowly altering the pulse width. And now we're at about 50% on our pulse width modulation amount, so I'm going to slowly start turning up the speed of the LFO. Now we're getting into sounds that I'm sure you've all heard before. Using an LFO that's not in time with the sequence, you can hear that we're not getting that repeated sound that we're getting while we're using the envelope modulation. Just a nice little amount of color added to the tone in our sequence. And that's also a really common way of using pulse width modulation, but let's go a step further and slowly start to increase the rate of our LFO. Now we're getting close to audio rate. On this spectrograph you can see that giant bump. That's our LFO. And obviously we're getting a very aggressive, almost FM-like sound. But unlike FM, our fundamental pitch is still clearly audible. It hasn't been changed. Okay, let's go even further. Let's go back to that C. Watch the LFO on the spectrometer and listen to what's happening. Oh, I forgot. I've got the LFO patched into the external in on the Matriarch so we can listen to it. And there's our LFO. Nice and low, rumbly, around 20 Hertz, but it's at audio rate. Sounds like angry bees. Slowly creep it up into audio rate, and you can hear harmonics being created by the LFO. And check this out, a major triad. Awesome. So we're getting polyphony from a monophonic synth. Cool. Let's listen to our LFO. It's playing a D flat. Don't know why that's working the way it does, but it is. Oh, I guess that's a C, but it's just slightly sharp. Yeah, you can see on the spectrograph how much harmonics are being created by that LFO. Let's freeze some and we can take a look at their frequencies. And I'm going to isolate them using the EQ here. Let's go down to the fundamental, which is the LFO. We're now hearing that as the fundamental. And let's solo it. And you can hear it's an octave below our VCO. There's our VCO, an octave higher. And now we're getting into the harmonics produced by the LFO. And there's our third. There's a minor seventh. It's really quiet. You can really only hear that if we isolate it. Cool. So these are all the harmonics that are being generated by our pulse width modulation at audio rate. Put them all together, you get a major chord. Well, it's really a dominant chord, but you can't really hear the seventh clearly. At least I can't. So, major triad. Super cool. Cool. Okay, well, let's make a patch out of this. So I'm going to take the keyboard out of the Mother 32 and patch that into the LFO rate input. So we're key tracking the LFO, and now we're going to have an 80s one-hit chord patch. Let's turn off the LFO. I guess that's more 90s, well, late 80s. But you get the idea. Little one-hits. Cool. Polyphony from a monophonic synth. Awesome. Okay, let's see what else we can get if we turn up our LFO rate even further. Ooh. Kind of a sus chord. Now it's in unison, and we're getting almost a sync sound, but I want to try to get that sus chord back. major. That's the 4 chord. It's not really a sus chord. It's an F chord now. It's harder to dial in. There we go. Well, it's not a sus chord. That's just fifths. Let's see what pitch we have on our LFO. An F. Makes sense. Oh, we could modulate this mixer too. No, that's for another time. Let's see how this one key tracks. Well, not great, but good enough for a 4th. I bet you if we filter it a bit, we can make it a little bit nicer. Yeah, it kind of disguises the out-of-tuneness a bit. But one of my favorite things to do in a situation like this where the key track is not working is to remove it. And now we get an ostinato bass with our sequence. Or pedal point, whatever you want to call it. But what's super cool about this is the character of the sound. It doesn't sound like 2 oscillators playing 2 different notes because the VCO is still being modulated. It's almost got kind of a digital artifact-y type sound, like a 12-bit sound on those higher notes, or computerish, I guess you might call it. Really like it. I'll just patch in the key tracking again. Yeah, that's cool, but I like it without the key tracking. Okay, let's continue. We're only at about 3/4 of our LFO speed, so let's see what happens if we keep turning up the rate. Oh, that's ugly and beautiful at the same time. Oh, more power chords. Key track this one. Nope, not so good. Pretty much the high range of this LFO. Tune it up a little bit better. There we go. Still doesn't key track that great. Let's keep going. So now our LFO and VCO are at the same pitch. There we go. And it kind of sounds like an oscillator sync. Especially if we just detune it slightly. Oop, that's too much. We can get it to pulse. It's slightly out of tune. And if we keep going, even more sync-like. That's cool. That's a cool sound. Awesome. It really does sound like oscillator sync. Let's see what happens if you key track it. Yeah. Not surprising, it's not going to do a very good job at the high LFO rate. Yeah, you basically got to tune with each note, so really only useful for single notes, I guess. Well, I guess that's how you can get a fake oscillator sync sound with the Mother 32. Oh! And more harmony. octave up. And another major chord just really high. Super cool. So we can get a lot of sounds just messing around with pulse width modulation at audio rate. Well worth whoa, that's cool. Yeah, well worth exploring. But let's continue on, and I'll show you how I built that patch at the beginning of the video. Now I'm going to do this patch on the Mother 32, but of course this is possible on pretty much any analog synth, as long as it has pulse width modulation, of course. So I'm going to post a patch diagram for how to do this on the Matriarch as well. I'll put a link to that in the index. All right, for this patch, you guessed it, we're going to modulate the pulse width at audio rate. I really liked the major chords, but what really blew my mind was the ostinato bass tuned to fourth below. So I'm going to start by recording in a sequence using just a major chord, major 7 chord in 2 octaves. Something that will work well over a pedal point. Cool. And I'm going to do it in F. Why not? Okay, and I'm going to open up the VCA so I can easily get my LFO and pulse width modulation in tune. I'm going to turn the pulse width modulation amount up to around 2 o'clock, make sure it's on LFO, and find that F. There we go. Great. Cool, sounds awesome already. Dial in an envelope shape I like. Okay, and what I'd like to be able to do is modulate this, the pulse width modulation amount. Now the Mother doesn't have a CV input for VCO mod amount, but we can work around that. So I'm going to go triangle LFO out into the VC mix input on channel 2 and out of the VC mix into VCO mod amount. Make sure the VCO mod knob is on full and the switch is on VCO mod. Now the VC mix knob controls the amount of modulation. Cool. And this is CV controllable. Excellent. So I'm going to patch out of the assign output on the Mother into the VC mix CV control input. Going to go into the global settings here on the Matriarch. Oops, I mean Mother. Said that so many times with the Matriarch. Anyway, page 1, which is indicated by the LED on the left, will change what the assign output is sending. Oh, that's cool. Nice. Oh, I really like that one. But number 8's what we're going for, fully random. And I'm going to offset the VC mix knob so more modulation gets through. And now let's mess around with the play order of the sequence. Get out of global settings and hit forward and back at the same time and hit the number buttons. Number 3's up and down, and number 4, fully random. Cool. Okay, now let's dial in some filter modulation. Just going to use the envelope for now to do this. So cutoff's fairly low, around 200 Hertz. And I want a long enough decay that we don't lose too much of those overtones we heard before. That sounds cool. Okay, let's have a quick listen. Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. Good starting point. One thing that really missing is some envelope modulation. Now, of course, we can do this manually. And I'll show you how we can do this using some other modules a little bit later on. But before we do that, let's add some more modulation to this patch. So I'm going to take the VC mix out and plug that into the Molt. Patch that back into the VCO mod so we get our pulse width back. And out of the other Molt, let's try the cutoff, see what happens. Oh, it's a little aggressive. But sounds pretty cool though. let's try resonance. That's a little more to my liking. So our audio rate LFO is modulating the pulse width as well as the resonance of the filter. And the amount of that modulation is being randomly controlled by our sequencer. And to give a little life, we can manually just turn the attack knob and get some different sounds. Now in the demo at the beginning of the video, I did have some external processing going on. I was using hardware, but I'm just going to do it with plugins this time. So I've got a universal audio distressor. And I'm going to get the attack to be a pretty fast attack and release. I'm going to put it all the way at 0. So that's the fastest possible release. I've got a high pass filter on the detector and our ratio is 3:1. And my input is set, so I'm averaging around 3 dB of gain reduction. So we're just lightly compressing. I also used a space echo, so I'm going to use the UA Galaxy Space Echo. It's a pretty good little copy. And I'm just going to find a delay time that I like. Well, that sounds good. And I'm going to pan the delay slightly to the right, just a little bit, around 2 o'clock, and I'll do the same with or the opposite to the dry signal, pan it a little bit to the left. Let's try to get a little bit of tape saturation if we crank up the input a little bit on the delay. And in terms of the balance, I want them pretty equal. Let's adjust the EQ a little brighter. Sounding good. Just tweak it a little bit though, work out that balance and mess around a little bit more with the delay time. On a real Space Echo, I've noticed that it doesn't really matter if it's in time. It sounds good no matter what. Oh, 2 heads sound pretty good on this plugin. But I'm going to go back to 1 and I'm going to try to get it to about 8th notes. Okay, enough messing around. All right, now let's add some reverb. Yeah, I don't really like the reverb on this plugin. And anyway, we want it on both dry and wet signals. So I'm going to use this another UA plugin, the AKG BX20 Spring Reverb. It doesn't sound like, the spring on a Fender amp, that springy sound. It's more lush and closer to a plate, but with its own characteristic. So I've got it in stereo mode, and I'm going to be using springs A and B. My decay time is around 2.5 seconds. I might turn that up a little bit, but I'm going to add some pre-delay, probably about 20 or 30 seconds of 20 or 30 milliseconds of pre-delay. And there we go. Okay, so that's the basic patch, but let's go one step further and figure out how we can modulate the envelopes on this Mother. So again, just playing manually with them is, it's fun if it's the only instrument you're playing at the moment. But if you got other stuff going on in your tune, you might want to have this automated. So I'm going to go out of the gate output. I'm going to use this Make Noise Maths, a great CV controllable envelope. Going into the trigger input. Out of channel 1, I'm going to go into the cutoff input on the Mother. And don't forget to turn the VCF mod amount down to 0. And now channel 1's tenuverter on Maths will be the amount of envelope modulation. We'll just dial in an envelope shape. The cool thing about using Maths as an envelope generator is, of course, we have control over the rise and fall, or attack and decay, but we also have control over the shape of the envelope, from linear to exponential. And as we go to exponential, you can hear how punchy it gets. Like, that's beautiful. Okay, but we want to modulate this envelope. So I'm going to use channel 4 of Maths. I've turned it into an LFO by pushing the cycle mode out of channel 4 into the attack or rise input, CV rise input on Maths. And now my attack time is being modulated. Let's change that envelope shape a little more linear. Cool. So that's the patch. Now it's just time to mess around and slowly tweak things and make the patch come to life. Oh yeah, and because I am not key tracking the LFO, our ostinato bass is always going to play an F. But as you see, if I change the key with the sequencer, our top notes are going to change. So anything that works good over F, like B flat for instance, is going to sound pretty cool. Okay, I'm just going to play around a little bit before we go on to the next thing. Okay, in the intro, I talked a little bit about using this Roland 512. Reason being is the Roland 512 has a sync output. So we're going to use that to modulate the rate of our LFO and see what happens. So first, let's just take a look and listen to the pulse wave in the 512. So as you see, it's not a perfect square, and I've already mentioned that that's pretty uncommon. And you can see it doesn't have the same range as the Mother 32 with the pulse width modulation. We're not going all the way to 0 on the duty cycle, so we're not going to be able to get those punchy transient patches we did with the Mother. But the Roland 540, or the envelope generator and LFO module with the System 500, has got ADSR envelopes, which is pretty cool, and the LFOs are actually pretty powerful. There's a lot of different options in terms of trigger sync and rate. Anyway, right now I've just got a triangle LFO patched in, as you can see into the scope. Zoom in a bit, and now we can see our wave again. So I've got it patched into the pulse width modulation amount, so let's try that out. Yep, there's pulse width modulation, just like on the Mother. So let's turn up our LFO rate until we get to audio rate. Yep, and right at the fastest speed, we're getting our triad again. So that's pretty cool. Okay, but the whole idea was seeing what would happen if we used the sync output of our oscillator to modulate the rate of our LFO. Well, there we go. We can see that our LFO is being reset by the VCO. And if we change the rate, oh yeah, we can get all kinds of cool sounds. Not quite sync sounds. If we wanted to get sync sounds, we'd just use the sync input and outs. But we can get polyphony. at the high end. Let's go with that. Okay, I'm going to quickly patch up a similar patch we just did with the Mother. In fact, I'm just going to use the Mother sequencer to control the Roland. So let's see what this sounds like. It's got its own little sound there, doesn't it? This thing always just sounds like 1978 to me. Now here's some good news if you want to try this on a module that doesn't have a sync out. The sync out is just a pulse wave at the same frequency as the oscillator. So if you want to do this on the Mother 32 or Matriarch, for instance, all you have to do is mult your VCO and use that to modulate your LFO rate. Done. Anyway, I'm just going to mess around with this for a little bit. I think that's going to do it for this video about pulse width modulation. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back pretty soon, I hope, with more videos and more Matriarch content.